If you noticed coming into the ashram, we have the first gate is called Vishnu Gate. And although you may not have seen it, the second gate at the end is the Shiva Gate. Actually, I think tomorrow we'll explain all of that in detail. But just to let you know the point that is important as a continuation of our conversation earlier today. Vishnu represents the Dvaita path, the path of the soul's devotion to a personal God. And it's not only the Hindu version of Vishnu that's referred to. Christianity is a Vaishnav path. In fact, the word Christ comes from Christo, which comes from Krishna. Jesus was asked, "Are you Krishna?" during his time, because the knowledge of Krishna was all over the known world at that time. Krishna was already a well-respected archetype, as was Rama. In fact, the city of Rome is named after Rama. And the myths of Indian philosophy and Dharma were already present in the Middle East and in Europe. But already at that time, there were myths about Krishna, who is an avatar of Vishnu. But what we have written is not historically correct. It is only a myth. But that which may be false historically can contain a tremendous amount of truth of a higher type. Now, the human intelligence is on a spectrum. There are beings of very low level of intelligence, very superficial, very gross, very incapable of thinking symbolically, abstractly, archetypally, and think only in the imaginary dimension. And for those, the mythologies of the current religions were necessary. You cannot teach young Sunday school children about the highest metaphysical truths. The problem is that in our educational system today, we never get beyond the Sunday school level. The real esoteric teachings of religion are left out. And so people have come to ridicule religion because they look at only the lower levels of the exoteric mythology as if that is what the religion is about. And on that level, what Freud said about religion in his famous critique, The Future of an Illusion, is correct. They're simply projections of a strong father who will protect you and a mother whose womb will be there for you, etc., etc. But clearly that is not the origin of religious thought. And the path of Dvaita, or the worship of the almighty power that has created this universe, is a necessary step in the development of our intelligence that must begin with humility. If we are not humble, if we arrogantly think we already know everything, and we think we are God, because the ego believes it is God. That's what narcissism is. That has to be humbled in order for us to realize that we really are God. But what we are is God who forgot it was God and then creates an ego that pretends it is God. And so the ego of the false pretense that it's already God must be popped so that the real God emerges. And it is only popped through the worship of the real God that is other than the ego. And so that's what the Vishnu Gate is about. Coming through the portal of humility and devotion, bhakti, in order to be able to discover at the end of the journey, which goes the way of the cosmic Christ, to Shiva Gate, which is the realization of the Advaita, the union, the realization that in fact, beyond the ego, you are that which you have been worshipping. But that comes at the end of a long journey. And you have to go beyond split mind rock to get there. If we don't heal that split, you never make it to Shiva Gate. There was an interesting encounter earlier this century. It was back in 1948 between I would say, the highest and the greatest of the Vishnu worshippers of the 20th century. His spiritual name was Sri Krishna Prem. We read a book of his, right? The Yoga of the Bhagavad Gita. Remember, a beautiful book, a great sage in his own right, but a devoted follower of Krishna. Actually, he worshipped Radha even more than he worshipped Krishna, but it was an absolute bhakti devotion. But at some point, he felt lacking. He felt distant from God, and that he needed the blessing of a sage who was higher than he was. And he received the inspiration to go and visit Ramana Maharshi. And so he left his ashram, which was up in the Himalayas by Almora, and he traveled all the way down to South India to have the darshan of Sri Ramana. And he sat there, and Ramana looked at him silently. Of course, Ramana doesn't say many words. But Sri Krishna Prem heard in his mind Ramana's voice saying, "Who are you? Who are you? Who are you?" Over and over again. He couldn't get away from it. It was starting to really disturb him. And so in his mind he answered, I'm the servant of Krishna. And then the voice said, "Who is Krishna?" And he said, Krishna is the one, the avatar who is in every heart. And he has said, "Who is in your heart? Go into your heart. Find out who are you who is sitting in your heart next to Krishna." And the voice kept going, and every time he tried to give an answer, Ramana's voice forced him deeper and deeper into his self. And his eyes were closed while he was having this kind of a battle with Ramana in his mind and trying to go to Krishna. At one point he started praying to Radha, and he said, "Here, you answer him." And he got a vision of Radha, and she shrugged, and she said, "You have to deal with him." And then Ramana came in his vision, and he said, "Then Ramana explained everything to me." And he couldn't believe the vision of light that Ramana gave him. And immediately his eyes opened, and he said in his mind silently to Ramana, he said, "Who are you?" And suddenly, right in front of him, Ramana disappeared. There was an empty couch. He was no longer there. He couldn't believe it. He closed his eyes. He said, "Wait a minute, I'm hallucinating." He opened his eyes again, and Ramana was back. And he said, "Whoa." And Ramana smiled at him, gave him a very knowing look, and Sri Krishna Prem bowed to him. And he got that message that Ramana was giving him. Don't believe in the form. The form is emptiness. The form is nothing. It is the light behind the form. And you are that. And so Krishna Prem left very much transformed by that meeting. And that integration of the Vishnu path and the Shiva path can only be achieved in the state of humility and openness to that which we cannot yet grasp, we cannot understand, and we can only surrender to. But the ego must give up its refusal to surrender. That's the main attribute of the ego. It refuses to give up its pseudo-control over its life. It has no real control, we all know that, but it's a pseudo-control that it either uses to hold on with money or with some demand that it hold on to addictions and negative traits, whatever it can. And that must be opened and surrendered. To find the emptiness, to find the empty couch that Ramana was showing him, to be able to find the self that is invisible in this world, that is not your body, but that is one with the cosmic intelligence that creates all that is. And so Ramana's teaching is appropriate for all of us. Each of us must hear his voice in your mind. Who are you? You must answer that for yourself. Who are you? And don't settle for an answer on the phenomenal plane. Don't settle for an answer that, oh, I do this for a living, or I do that, or I'm this person's husband or wife, or whatever. You cannot answer it in those terms. You cannot answer it in terms of whatever the body happens to be doing. You cannot even answer it in the framework of the mind. And so you must find the answer to that question, who am I? And you cannot use words to find that answer, because no words can grasp the self. And it's in that refusal to accept anything less than the direct realization of the self that you are that will free you from the suffering of the ego. And when the mind has been stilled, and all of the egoic attempts to find a pseudo-answer and settle for that, so as to enable the ego to continue its game of pleasure and pain. When all of that is dissolved and we sit in the stillness and refuse to exteriorize the mind and run away from ourselves into the next moment, but we stay in the present, then the divine presence, the eternal presence, and the sweetness of love will emerge into our space. And the power of that energy of the Supreme Being is the source of our salvation. It is that Shaktipat that comes to us in the moment of surrender, that lifts us out of the hell realm of the egoic suffering. That is the only way out of the trap. There is no way out on the level of mind. You cannot think your way out. You cannot figure your way out. You can't take drugs and find a way out. You can't get out through any egoic means of changing your external life. You can only get out by going within to the depth. And then your life will change, because you will have the courage to act from the real self. Very radical changes may happen, but they won't be changes that are happening in order to try to control and repress the unconscious and get away from one's anxieties and one's shadow. All of that will have been dissolved and can only be dissolved by the power of God. There is no pill that any psychiatrist can prescribe that will cure you of anxiety. It can cover it over for a few hours. You can have a Band-Aid, but it won't get to the root of the issue. And life will never be satisfying and fulfilling until you get to the very core of your being. And free yourself by that realization of the eternal self, of the fear of death, and the agony of the egoic suffering that is based on its own feeling of lack. That lack can never be healed except through union with God. It is God that we lack. And that when we have surrendered to that one who can fulfill the lack, then the one who was lacking dissolves, because that one never existed in the first place. And then we are in the Advaita realization. And so there is really nothing to do in the practice. We sit here, but what do we do while we sit here? You cannot think the words, who am I, who am I? That won't get you there. It helped Sri Krishna Prem, yes, because he was forced to go beyond words through Ramana's relentless pushing him deeper inward. But the question of who am I must be answered only with the intuitive feeling of the self. It cannot be through a description. It cannot be a talking to another. It has to be an immersion into the very source and the core of the heart. An immersion into the silence that is deeper than words. And a willingness to stay in that silence until the ego has been completely dissolved. The good news is that can all happen in 12 and a half minutes. Yogis timed it. They're very accurate about these things. You can get to the first stage of samadhi with 12 and a half minutes of silence. I would love to time people here, but I don't know if they can be silent for 12 and a half minutes. When we get to that point, we'll start doing our own research on that. But that's what is said, that it takes only that amount of time to erase the tapes. And then once they're erased, the chatter doesn't start again. It's done. No more messages left on your answering machine by the other. It's erased once and for all, and then there is no other. So are you willing to sit uninterruptedly, without interrupting yourself with your ego, for a short few minutes to achieve liberation? If there is true love for God, it's very easy. But if our capacity for love, if our faith is lacking, remember that last one, Shraddha, the last of the 6 treasures we talked about yesterday. Or was it this morning? It was this morning. That faith in the presence of God as the self is the key to being able to open your heart. But it has to be a faith also in yourself that you are worthy of receiving the ultimate blessing. You must know that you are a child of God. You were brought here for the one purpose of the glorification of God through falling into illusion, ignorance, sin, call it whatever you will, into Maya, in order to return. The journey has to go into the darkness in order to appreciate the light. The world has to have a Kali Yuga. It has to have a time of darkness and fall and pain and suffering and cynicism and complete eclipse of God consciousness. Just like that. It all has to fall in order to be picked up again and returned to the source. And so if we are willing to accept that we have been on a long, strange journey into the darkness, to gather experience, to gather knowledge that we could not have had if we stayed in the light. We had to make this journey, and many blessings will come from this journey, but you can't you can't convert the experiences into the blessings until you have returned. And as you come back through from the lower chakras that we have fallen to, back upward, then all of that which has been addiction and greed and lust and pain and suffering and anxiety and all of that is transformed. It becomes again the great blessings of wisdom that will enable you to be a healer for others. That's the archetype of the wounded healer. And everyone at this moment in time has been wounded. If you haven't been wounded, in fact, you won't be as powerful a healer because you won't understand the pain of other people. And the only way you can have compassion for the pain of others is if you have gone through some of that pain yourself and have converted it into wisdom. And so in a way, those who have fallen the furthest become the greatest teachers. Some of those who were the most, had lives as criminals and as dissolute beings living and enjoying the jouissance of the lower chakras have become the greatest saints and sages. In every tradition, the Christian, the great Tibetan saint who was a murderer, what was his name? His name escapes me for the moment, but was a very powerful teacher, one of the highest of any tradition. Same with St. Augustine, same with many saints. And so the falling is only a fall into experiences that will turn into wisdom. It is not something to feel bad about or feel shame about. But don't stay in the fallen state. Bring the wisdom back to the source. That's what this time is now about. Convert the pain into power, the power of love.